It seems much better advertisement for God to say with George Steiner that Christianity put an end to tragedy. In a cosmos in which death is succeeded by resurrection, Steiner considered, the terror of tragedy is suspended. There is no ultimate horror if all is ultimately to be reconciled. Steiner followed Nietzsche in laying what he called the death of tragedy at the feet of the cross. I taught divinity in Presbyterian Aberdeen for a decade and a half, and once, visiting Maynooth in the days of the great and much missed James McEvoy, an Irish friend who is here in the audience today, shocked my refined ecumenical sensibility by telling a joke about the elder Reverend Ian Paisley. It runs somewhat like this. Ian Paisley asked some school children to give an example of a tragedy. One child replied, "If someone fell off a tree, that would be a tragedy." Paisley answered, "That would not be a tragedy, it would be an accident." A second child piped up and said that if a bus full of children were to drive off a cliff, that would be a tragedy. Paisley again rejected this as a false example, claiming that that would be a disaster but not a tragedy. A third child, perhaps exasperated by Paisley's fuss-budget approach to defining tragedy, declared, "If you were in a helicopter and it crashed, that would be a tragedy." "Absolutely right," smirked the Reverend, "and how do you defend that definition?" "It would not be a disaster," the child replied, "and it sure would not be an accident." I got that joke from Patrick Gorovan. So, I wish to propose that there is a human need to articulate some of our experiences neither as disastrous nor as accidental catastrophes, but actually as tragic. Pascal is speaking to this need when he describes the human creature as riven between grandeur and misery. Shakespeare addresses this same desire when Lear describes Edgar as a poor bare-forked animal. My claim is not that we want tragedies to happen to us, but that we want some of what has happened to us to be tragic. Given the unendurable weights which most human persons endure, weights which by nature are unendurable to us, we desire to be able to locate some of our experiences within the range of tragedy. No human life lacks at least one moment in which a fellow could say with Bob Dylan, "My burden is more than I can bear." The grandeur of the tragic hero is that his dark burden is more, humanly speaking, than he can bear. We don't want it to be empty histrionics when we rebuff the "I'm sorry for your loss" categorization of our experiences. We don't want to recognize an interior barnstorming ham in our perception of ourselves as outrageous villains who are nonetheless perhaps more sinned against than sinning. We need to see our persistent lapses of taste, judgment, style, and the simplest morality as the fall of a hero from a very great height. We want a mysterious combination of fate and free will to accompany our journey beyond loss, accident, and disaster into tragedy itself. We want the very gods to have plotted this, the fates to have woven our tortured story, and Tiresias to warn us. We would settle for membership of a tragic family which passes on its superb iniquities from generation to generation. And we need our spectacular fall through criminality into much-deserved suffering to be cathartic. We want to make of it a gift offering or a thank offering or one of the other 9 different kinds of offering in the Old Testament. We need it to be acclaimed. We want to articulate our sufferings as tragedy and to do so without too much absurdity. We want the genre of our human lives to fall into the category of tragedy and not farce or fiasco. So it's not a matter of our solitary roles. It's not just that I want to identify my autobiography with that of King Lear or Lady Macbeth. I cannot shout at the grave like Hamlet or roar at the desolate heath like Lear in one enormous, shrieking guitar solo. There are many players in Macbeth, none of them escaping its tragic reach, because every aspect of the region in which it happens is regulated by the rules of tragedy. Everyone is playing the same game. The existence of Lear or Cordelia stands or falls with the reality of the domain and realm of tragedy. The quality of tragedy in any individual life is a moment in the real existence of tragedy as a metaphysical law of the land. Tragedy is not the grandeur of the excess suffering borne by any single individual. It is an entire play of events, circumstances, and persons. They fuck you up, your mum and dad, as Philip Larkin put it, and Oedipus had parents and guardians who ignored numerous prophetic warnings. Oedipus failed to forestall his fate and gripped that fate. His character was his destiny. By the time he arrives at the place where three roads meet, he is the kind of person who would kill anyone at all who stood in his way. His own free actions compound perfectly with his fate, and all of his companions and the events around him conspire to make him the tragic everyman who haunts our Western imaginations. He could only exist within a tragic universe, one in which fate is aloof in its ghastly, ineluctable logic, and yet stoops to single out this one forked animal and swoops down upon him, not blindly, but with a perfect eye for his uncontrolled rage and arrogance. I do not say, of course, that all of us at all times inhabit this deadly region. Tragedy is a shifting field of force which from time to time catches each of us in its laws. It imposes itself upon us. That does not simply mean that bad things happen to good people, though they do, but that good people, in company with others, know themselves to be burdened excessively and righteously. The weight of suffering is excessive, too much for me to bear, and quite unreflective of anyone's sense of fair play, not sporting, not rational, and yet so entirely righteous and fitting that the bearer gains in stature with every excessive weight that is added to her load. Aeschylus could define tragedy in the formula pathos mathos, suffering leading to learning, because the learning consists in the deeper acknowledgement of the rightness of the tragic hero's status, his deepening perception that even this insanity makes sense and is purpose-bearing. They come to grasp the field of force which has seized them, to acknowledge its laws and its justice. Does it follow from this that a condition of the possibility of our desire for tragedy is a transcendent God or two who represent absolute justice, justice with a capital J? Does justice call for a majuscule capital J for justice God with balance and scales, who can recompense all of the empirical rights and wrongs, and make all of this suffering add up so that the outcome is the uplift of catharsis and not the flattening of deflation? When urged to desire peace and reconciliation in his country, a Ukrainian friend, he said that he wanted the Russians to be reconciled with the soil. A flat, face-down reconciliation with the earth is all that awaits the tragic hero's descent from his plinth if he inhabits a naturalistic universe. Writing against George Steiner's proposal that Christianity put an end to tragedy, the author Lucy Beckett contends to the contrary, that there can be no tragedy in a godless cosmos. Modern naturalism, she chides, cannot define tragedy, let alone experience it or imagine its way into it. Lucy Beckett argues that tragedy requires a transcendent god or gods because it requires that human life is of absolute value. If Pentheus or Macbeth do not have immortal souls, we might perhaps say, it diminishes the tragedy of their casting their souls away. Lucy Beckett takes to task those who leave the premise of God out of their definition of tragedy. In his book on tragedy, Adrian Poole makes an observation which may be taken as representative of the late 20th century's intellectual confusion. Tragedy embodies our most paradoxical feelings and thoughts and beliefs. It gives them flesh and blood, emotional and intellectual and spiritual substance. Through tragedy, we recognize and feel our sense of both the value and futility of human life, of both its purpose and its emptiness. Well, which, Lucy Beckett asks. Having it both ways is rationally impossible does not seem to strike such writers. Either everything means something or nothing means anything. But the first requires belief in God, while the second is perhaps too frightening to be faced by those without Nietzsche's desperate courage. That's Lucy Beckett. I suppose that many people may feel, in response to Lucy Beckett's taunt, something equivalent to not so fast natural gas. One natural equivalent to transcendent sublime fate or cosmic justice, which seems to work on some levels for many moderns, is society itself. As an all-encompassing, unavoidable power which renders us utterly helpless and before which any lone individual is absolutely vulnerable, society itself seems to do the work which used to be allotted to the fates or to a righteous judge. Societies, collectivities, crowds, and mobs vent their violence on individuals, crucify or stone them, expel them, and by this act of expulsion unload their violence, excreting it onto the pharmacos victim. By collectively unloading their inner violence onto the pharmacos, the tragic victim, societies expunge themselves of the effects of this inner violence, plagues, epidemics, and general rottenness in the state of Denmark. Thus, we may invent interpretations of the Oedipus story, in which the Thebans blame Oedipus for the plague and infertility which inflicts them, inculpate him through the devious figure of Tiresias, and achieve catharsis by casting their violence and their guilt into their erstwhile king. Behind this conception is a sociological vision of society as a kind of immanent divinity. In this sociological vision, society is a purity cult writ large, controlling and expelling impure members, whose impurity makes them to represent the meaningless, dirty third, which must be outed, discharged, and erased. Tragedy, then, would be a societal self-cleansing, in which the violence, suppressed by rigid obedience to the rules of purity, is visited upon one marked out as impure. So the very act of expulsion of the scapegoat is a dispumation, a squeezing out of the human face of the bubonic bubo. Many Christian thinkers seem relaxed with adapting the idea that a violent mechanism of expectorating scapegoats lies at the origin of all religion except only Christianity itself. They see the Christ figure as superseding and sublimating the scapegoat figure by putting an end to the violence at its origin. The cycle of violence ends when the mob crucifies God himself and God goes to his death like a lamb to the slaughter without opening his mouth and pacifically withholding retaliation. So unlike the hawkish Lucy Beckett, these dove-like Christians have an olive branch to offer Dr. George Steiner. Christianity does indeed put an end to tragedy by throwing the pacific spanner of the crucifixion into the working of the scapegoat mechanism. Again, as with the first proposal, I would advise not so fast natural gas. We should interrogate the notion. We could ask how well the notion of a pharmacos cleansing mechanism fits onto the stories of the tragedies we have. Do the classical tragic stories of the Greeks or the Renaissance masters rehearse the tale of a mob cathartically unleashing its violence on a hapless victim whose ensuing death disinfects his community? Fumigation for antiseptic purposes is a rational activity, so we would be looking for a story in which an irrational force of mob violence is used to channel an ultimately rational design. The closest one can think of to this story is found in the Bacchae, where Pentheus refuses to acknowledge the god Dionysius. Dionysius hypnotizes him to laugh as a bacchant, and then incites the women of the city, including his mother and his aunt, into a murderous frenzy in which they tear Pentheus limb from limb. Pentheus's crime is his hyper-rationality, his egg-headed refusal to admit the irrational worship of Bacchus. The denial of devotion is met first by a magical hypnotic transformation into a devotee, and then by death at the hands of crazed worshippers. Though he dies at the hands of the mob, there is nothing rational and nothing disinfecting about Pentheus's death. Rather, it inculpates all the women of the city of pointless murder. Pentheus is like Othello in seeking to banish doubt, skepticism, belief, and faith, and being shredded limbless by the unholy imitation of faith, the drunken and ripped enthusiasm of the Bacchantes. It is hard to think of a tragic hero whose death serves a pharmacological scientific plan. Some tragic characters seem to be torn between imperatives or rent between different versions of justice, like the dock workers in The Wire Season 2 or Iphigenia. It does not look like the rational pursuit of the excision of a cancer when the little girl Iphigenia is sacrificed so her father Agamemnon can uphold his family honor by taking his ships to Troy. Other tragic characters are hubristic, mortals who comport themselves as if they were gods, like Agamemnon unfurling a red carpet. Orestes is another who must revenge his father Agamemnon's death by killing his mother, but must be pursued by the Furies for killing his mother. It is because the cycle of vengeance and blood revenge in the Oresteia is simultaneously rational and irrational that only a goddess, Athena, can put an end to it. What takes the tragic hero or heroine down, in each case, seems to transcend the rational and the irrational. To be absolutely innocent, like Oedipus, fated at birth to patricide and to spawning brother sons, and absolutely guilty, like Oedipus, a homicidal guy who lusts for his mother, transcends irrationality and rationality in the direction of a pure paradox of the human condition. The question is not whether the violent mob's medicinal expulsion of their projected scapegoat helps us to interrogate those classical tragedies whose stories are imprinted in our memories. The question is whether, when we ask for our suffering to fall into the genre of tragedy, we are expressing a deep-seated need to be found guilty by our tribe, to be identified by our tribe as the source and offscoring of all that ill affects it, and therefore to be expelled, hurled from a cliff, stoned, fully excreted, taking with me as I go the entirety of my tribe's violence and malfeasance. Do I want to be the means by which my community disinfects itself by being identified as its scourge, excised like a cancer and expelled? When I ask for my story somehow to fit into the tragic register, am I asking for my suffering to be a punishment which purifies my people? These are not rhetorical questions which answer themselves. The profound human impulse to servant suffering is evidenced by soldiers and by the universal respect and reverence in which their sacrifice is held. Their sacrifice is awe-inspiring, and that means regarded as somewhat of the divine. The self-sacrifice of the soldier is not seen as hubristic or arrogant. Death for the city is almost the only way a fellow can approach the immortals without inciting their jealous wrath. It's a way in which the limits the gods set on the human can be safely breached. The impulse to self-sacrifice is seen universally as a gateway to divinity. The Herculean in humanity is fulfilled by self-sacrifice. That is, our desire to labor and defeat dragons and do the impossible on behalf of our tribe. And yet, it would not be very meaningful to be expelled and murdered by the tribe if I am not in fact guilty. If my guilt is simply a projection of their mob violence, it would be rather absurd and meaningless to be murdered by them. The sense of my Herculean vocation as a scapegoat depends on the justice of the charge. And who is this angry mob to victimize me without trial? Who are they to say? Where is the justice in being the blameless victim of mob violence, a violence which of course only adds to the criminality of the crowd? Is what I am looking for in seeking to identify my sufferings as tragic, to be the blameless victim of a mob who unjustly and randomly select me for the role? Do I want to be the empty screen onto which their criminality is projected and to carry their guilt away with me in lieu of my own? In myself, I seem to be both less guilty than my tribe, numerically speaking, and more guilty in that my individual sins are qualitatively deeper than mob violence. If rather than saying with Aeschylus, the justice of Zeus is inscrutably at work here, or with Sophocles, fate has done this, or with Euripides, the gods are to blame, if rather than saying that a more than human, more than cosmic force is at play in my suffering, we say that society has enforced this pharmacological role, then we do not speak to the excessive quality of tragic horror. To be caught in the maw of tragedy seems to include, but also to exceed, being caught in a society's determination to cleanse itself. Hamlet seems to eat, consume, and absolve in his death everything that is rotten in Denmark, but his death seems more momentous and even more purposeful than cleansing the state of Denmark. What I am looking for, then, in seeking to name my condition as tragic, may include a cleansing of society, a role as suffering servant, but also seems to be wider and deeper. As I said, I think Oedipus's character is his destiny, and he exercises free will as much as he is fated. In the Greek tragedies, the protagonist's free will is relatively muted, but it is still discernible. It's a sign that the inspiration of classical Greek tragedy is coming to an end, when Euripides gives us tragic heroes like the Trojan women, who are purely and simply victims. With the great Christian tragedies of the Renaissance, free will openly cooperates with fate, as in Macbeth's overt choice of the fate which the witches or their master have in store for him. This must be, in part, because the great archetype of a tragic hero for the Christian centuries so copiously and manifestly did everything in his power to provoke his own crucifixion. Every Sabbath healing, every infringement of the law, every hubristic assertion of his own divine power to forgive sin is a public provocation. His entire public ministry is taken up with actions intended to trigger the Pharisees, the scribes, the priests, and their henchmen, the Romans, into executing him. Christ mercilessly instigates his chosen instruments to murder him. He is very far from a hapless, peaceful scapegoat who is seized and destroyed by the unjust violence of the Jewish mob. If with John we place the cleansing of the temple at the outset of the mission, we can say that from the first step he engineers his death through his words and outraging actions. Just as God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh, so Jesus deliberately engenders misunderstanding and hatred. No tragic hero or heroine, and especially not their archetype and model in Jesus Christ, resembles the helpless human being whom ancient peoples used against their will as pharmacological experiments in ethnic cleansing. But why would Christ want to make a tragic hero of himself and thus engender the terrifying genre? The proposal that God would want to help us make pitiful, tragic heroes and heroines of ourselves seems jarring and irrational. To implicate God in gamely providing the conditions for tragedy seems to worsen the human burden and not lighten matters one single whit. 5 or 6 years ago, irritation with the malfunctioning of social institutions had evoked a burn-it-all-down mood in some quarters. We should drain the swamp, burn it down, and start over, many people averred. John Darnielle in The Mountain Goats wrote a lyric called Going Invisible No. 2, which goes, "I'm going to burn it all down today and sweep all the ashes away. Etch an outline on your heart, I'm going to blow the whole circus apart. Reckon the remnants when they land at last, the shattered aftermath of the blast. Look for me everywhere the burn marks form, trying to find a place to keep warm." Once we have burned it all down, Darnielle's lyric suggests, we find ourselves crouching in the scorched remnants, trying to find a place to keep warm. What good could God do by enabling us to burn and scorch the human condition? We don't want God huddling amongst us, many will say, trying to, like us, to keep warm as the cold winds blow on the heath. We are looking for a God who enables us to transcend and surpass that which is tragic in our condition and circumstance. Christian thinkers make themselves unpersuasive, it may be said, by trying to persuade us into a God who not merely shares in our tragedies, but is the condition of their reality. Except in the thinnest and most metaphorical sense, the suffering God is unhelpful. In response to this widespread objection, let me be clear that when I claim that God makes for tragedy, I do not intend to say that God set himself on fire and thus causes us to suffer, and then sits within the great field hospital of the church, holding our bandaged swathed hand and eternally yet empathetically sharing in the pain of our third-degree burns. I fully agree that a God who merely co-suffers with our excruciating pain does us no favors and offers no genuinely helping hand. For God to share in our death agony as such, merely by sharing in that agony, does not make my death agony any less of a death agony. We need no reminding that this God would share in our death throes at the unfavorable distance of an omnipotent immortal. Tragedy is pathos mathos. It is learning through suffering, not as a bug, but as a feature of our metaphysical reality. The arc of history bends toward tragedy to the extent that it curves toward learning and deepening realism. Tragedy is not meaningful in itself, but knowing that the tragic is part of the hardcore of the real means that knowing that suffering is a means to learning, to becoming inward with reality and the way it flows. Before there was tragic drama, before there were amphitheaters in which actors staged tragic dramas, there was a universal experience of human guilt and the need to expiate it. Not, mark you, a universal sense of pollution, which needs to be pseudo-scientifically cleansed by expulsion, but a sense of having offended the gods. Not just whimsical deities, gods who take umbrage at the refusal of a sexual advance, or goddesses making mortal stalkers all too cognizant of their mortality. Rather, the universal experience which undergoes the much later scripting and performance of tragedy is a sense of having failed to follow the course set by the stars and wandered outside the ordained paths. Admittedly, primitive men and women must have sometimes felt that one needed a Jesuit casuist at hand to thread one's ways between the varying demands of conflicting moralities. But it seemed impossible to be human without transgressing, and to transgress, to need to expiate, or to receive punishment as recompense, seemed part and parcel of the human condition. We may say that if comedy is born of the natural sense that we are made for heavenly bliss, tragedy is born of the historical but no less natural acknowledgement that we are bound for hell, and deservedly. John Henry Newman gives a phenomenological description of the primitive mentality which precedes tragedy by many centuries, and which ultimately is artistically imitated in the toils of the tragic hero. Newman claims it is scarcely necessary to insist that wherever religion exists in a popular shape, it has invariably worn its dark side outward. It is founded on the sense of sin, and without that vivid sense, it would hardly have any precepts or any observances. Its varieties all proclaim or imply that man is in a degraded servile condition and requires expiation, reconciliation, and some great change of nature. Also is the notion of our guilt impressed upon us by the doctrine of future punishment, and that eternal which is found in mythologies and creeds of such various parentage. Of these distinct rites and doctrines embodying the severe side of natural religion, the most remarkable is that of atonement, that is, a substitution offered or some personal suffering for a penalty which would otherwise be exacted. Most remarkable, I say, both from its close connection with the notion of vicarious satisfaction and from its universality. The practice of atonement is remarkable for its antiquity and universality, proved by the earliest records that has come down to us from all nations and by the testimony of ancient and modern travelers. What Newman places at the origin of the religious sense, that is, the need to make expiatory sacrifice, to make its way into the artistic stories and stage dramas into which the writer and then the performers project the archetypal human story as one in which a blue-blooded hero like Agamemnon or Xerxes enculpates himself and is required to give his or her life in recompense. Sacrifice is a kind of ritual, and I do not mean to suggest that expiatory rituals as such were imitated in the creation of tragic stage dramas. No corn gods were hurt in the making of the first theatrical tragedies. At the origin is simply the sense that we have done something wrong, the all-seeing gods know about it, and the divine punishment will comically and ineluctably hunt us down. An artistic imitation of the impulse which produces sacrificial ritual creates tragic drama. That gives us the Oresteia, the Persians, the meta-tragedy of Oedipus, and even down to the dramas of Euripides, in which the justice of the gods does seem to appear sometimes as unsporting and vindictive. Drama fades, disappears, and is reborn with the medieval Quem Curetis plays performed on Easter Day in dozens of liturgical settings. There may be some historical connection between the mystery plays being written and performed in England and the emergence of the great tragedy and comedy the world has ever seen in Elizabethan London. What is remarkable after 1,500 years of Christianity is how strictly the original classical forms of tragedy and comedy retain their purity and savagery. I place myself open to correction, but it seems as if all Christianity had to add in this moment of dramatic creativity was an accentuation of the freedom of the protagonists. Othello and Macbeth both are seduced and trapped by demonic forces, but they willfully enable their own seduction. It is a seduction, not a rape. Iago and the witches have chosen their man with precision. They know their victim to be ripe for the plucking, and we see these heroes seize their destiny with both hands, their freedom fully engaged in the seduction. After the great resurgence of tragedy and comedy from Shakespeare to Molière and Racine, begins an experiment in abolishing the finality of the last curtain. F. Scott Fitzgerald was exactly wrong when he observed that there are no second acts in American life. The effort to create a second, third, fifth, 11th, and 15th act energizes our great enterprising democracies, and its artistic counterpart is the end of story of calamities in search of a happy ending. It seems as though in a naturalistic cosmos, tragedy slides into melodrama where there is no last act, no final pronouncement of the guilt or innocence through travail of the protagonist. The story of a perpetual, sharp-leaping quest for the reconciliation of all contrary and diverse and opposite things is our modern melodrama. It can be called a tragicomedy, a tragedy in search of a comedic ending, one which is no more unlikely and deus ex machina than the series of accidents and disasters which beset the protagonists. It seems as though the yearning quest for expiation and justice was replaced by the quest for a comeback. What happens at the same time is that comedy no longer glorifies the human condition. Contemporary comedy no longer expresses the deep-seated vocation of men and women to parade into heaven wearing a spangled cape, seated on an elephant to the sound of trumpets and gongs, and the even louder applause of the saints and martyrs. Comedy seems set perpetually on the lowest register of satire. Satire seems to have absorbed the entire three-storied region of comedy. We have no paradisial comedy, but only the blackest of infernal comedias. And then something funny happened. The more the hero of comedy ceased to be a comic hero and became a comedic butt, a victim of his own hapless determination to make the worst possible choice in any given situation, the darker our laughter became, the more the lead's heroic status was stripped from him. As the blows rained down on him or her, the more it seemed as if comedy was burrowing down into tragedy. It seems as if, in an ever darker satirical portrayal of the human, in its ambitions and desires, we have recreated the tragic hero whose fate evokes horror and pity. As the satire became more brutal, cringe-making, and violent, so the hero or heroine rose to the occasion, as if we must accord the human justice and acknowledgement. It seemed as if the catharsis which the tragic plot used to evoke is now drawn out by ever darker satire. The satire of Michael White in Brad's Status and White Lotus, the deadly satire of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, in which the trickster hero has descended, through his own volition, into a tragic figure. It seems as if tragedy has reappeared, breaking through within comedy and transforming the chaplanesque fool of the comedic butt into a tragic figure. It seems as if tragedy cannot be exercised even within a supposedly secular and disenchanted culture. What is happening is that the genre of tragedy and comedy have been pushed ever closer to one another. It seems as if the tragic hero constantly pursues an ever-deferred comedic conclusion. But on the other hand, what moves the two classical genres together by a kind of gravitational force is the ever-deepening efflorescence of Christ in our culture. We recognize not only the ways in which he provokes his own death, but owns his own self-mockery. He sends up the figure of the Messiah in the sun by riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. He is not only made a fool of, but makes a fool of himself, always in command of his own self-humiliation. The crucifix has germinated in our culture, leading us to see him ever more fully as the figure of the fool and the archetype of tragedy. Christians have always acclaimed, by death you defeated death, but the interior appropriation of what it would mean to defeat death by death is beginning to dawn, and so is the rearticulation of the tragic moment. When we say that God in Christ reconciled the world to himself is the condition for the possibility of tragedy, we mean that our burdens are not accidents, fiascos, or catastrophes. We mean that God knows as God what the creature experiences as tragedy, and this is the source of the possibility of that experience of grandeur in misery. We mean that tragedy is an element of the modus operandi of our cosmos, reflecting something in God to which it is remotely analogous. What is negatively tragic in the creature is positive and active in the inner divine being, in its self-articulation. The self-articulation of the divine being includes the word sacrifice, or the self-naming of the one divine being attributes sacrifice to the word. In and through the self-engendering of the Trinity, an eternal Lamb is slain, and this slaughter is the positive and creative condition of what negatively and privatively in the human creature is tragedy. We might even say that the Lamb slain is the condition of naming the fall as tragic and not a primeval disaster or fiasco. There is no eternal tragedy within God, nor an eternal comedy of resurrection, but there is that in God which makes for tragedy, and that in God which makes for an eternal comedic reward of eternal life.